Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to join. I'd like to first start by thanking Martin, Mary, and Pat for organising this call and really allowing me the opportunity to speak with you. So my name is Philip Kelly, and I'm the IVD project manager at the HPRA, and that means that part of my job involves looking at the in vitro diagnostics regulation and to try and see how we can go about best implementing this within Ireland, both within the HPRA and to engage with other people that have to also implement this in their own organisations. So today I'm going to talk to you about the in vitro diagnostics regulation, but specifically I'm going to focus in on in-house devices, or as you may call them, laboratory developed tests as well. So just to give a bit of an overview as what I'm going to talk about today, I'll start off by just giving a bit of background as to how we got to the IVDR and the regulation and why these changes are coming in. Then I'll focus and talk about what is an in-house IVD, how do you go about making one, what's the definitions around that. And then I'm going to spend a large amount of time talking about the requirements for in-house IVDs that are in place or coming into place under the regulation. I'll talk about when they apply and then give some practical considerations about how you may go about trying to reach compliance with the regulation. But just to start with, by means of, I suppose, a history lesson, we're currently working with the in vitro diagnostics regulation, but before that, starting in 1998, we had the IVD directive. And the IVD directive consisted of 24 articles and 10 annexes. And because it was a directive, that had to be written into national law in every member state where it applied. When we move to the regulation, a regulation applies directly in each EU member state. So it's a bit of a different legal framework. And when the regulation was published in 2017, there was 113 articles and 15 annexes. So you can see there's an awful lot more detail in the regulation in comparison with its predecessor. And it strengthens a lot of the requirements for medical devices, especially around clinical evidence and about supply chain aspects. So originally it was published in 2017, and there was a 5-year initial transition period for the regulation before it came into force. So what that means is there was 5 years built into the regulation for all the different organizations and stakeholders to come to terms with what the requirements are and to start to implement those requirements. But in January of 2022, in response to the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, there was an amendment to the regulation. That's Regulation 2022-112. And what that did was it actually staggered when some of those timelines applied further. So instead of everything applying in May of 2022, for traditional manufacturers who sell IVDs, it staggered when some of the requirements applied to them to enable them more time to prepare for the requirements. And for in-house device manufacturers and in the in-house device space, it staggered the requirements so that only a minority of them applied in May of last year, and they kind of phase in over time. So the next currently we're here in January 2024. The next big set of requirements for in-house devices is May of this year. So that's point B, C, E, F, G, H, and I of Article 5.5. And don't worry, I'll talk through Article 5.5 in a lot of detail later. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be familiar with the content underneath each of these kind of points.
Well, yeah, it's actually this good.
I was thinking the same. Yeah.
I better get mine.
I could just ask people to put themselves on mute.
I've muted everybody. So, Philip, if you unmute yourself now, please. Again.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate it. And then in May of 2028, the final point comes into play. So there's a little bit of additional time required before that last piece comes in. And that's really around a kind of a clinical justification and a review of devices available on the market. But don't worry, we'll talk through all of those details as we go through this presentation. But just to take a bit of a step back, if you're going to be making an in-house IVD, it first has to be an IVD. So we need to explore what qualifies as an IVD, what is an in vitro diagnostic medical device, and what is the definition of that. And the regulation provides a lot of definitions under Article 2. The definition of an IVD is under Article 2, Paragraph 2, and it means any medical device which is a reagent product, calibrator, control material, kit, instrument, apparatus, piece of equipment, software or system, where they're used alone in combination, intended by the manufacturer to be used in vitro to examine specimens, including blood and tissue donations derived from the human body, solely or principally for the purpose of providing information on one or more of the following. So what that means is there's a lot of different things that can be an IVD. It can be reagents, it can be instruments, it can be software. The whole purpose is it's examining in vitro specimens to give information that's medically relevant. And that information may be concerning physiological or pathological processes or states. You could be looking to see if somebody's markers are within the right physiological parameters or if they're indicative of a certain pathology. You could be looking at congenital physical or mental impairments within the prenatal space, the prenatal testing space. You could be looking at predisposition to a medical condition or disease, possibly in the genetic testing space. You may be looking at determining the safety and compatibility with potential recipients, so transfusion and transplantation. You could be looking to predict treatment responses or reactions. So this could be either personalized medicine or companion diagnostics area where you're trying to pair patients with the best therapy or treatment for them, or to avoid undue adverse reactions if they're predisposed to them. Or you could be looking to define or monitor therapeutic measures. So there's a lot of different things that can meet the definition of an IVD. And if you have an IVD, there's three main routes for compliance with the regulation. So the first one, and the one that's predominantly used, is a manufacturer who wants to sell their IVD will CE mark their device. And in order to do that, they undergo a process called a conformity assessment, where they have to assess and provide evidence to support that their devices meet the requirements of the regulation. Under the IVDR, the majority of devices have an independent body called a notified body that actually assesses that documentation and makes sure that they have met the requirements. And if they do, they can place the device on the market with the CE mark. So if you're purchasing and using CE marked IVDs and using them within their intended purpose, that's compliant with the regulation. The middle box there talks about kind of more the research space. So if you're investigating some IVDs, you could be using them for some exploratory biomarkers in the context of clinical trial, or you could be trying to confirm or establish some analytical or clinical performance. You may be in the space of doing a performance study. And if you're doing a performance study, there's a separate set of rules that apply. And if you meet those rules, then you're compliant with the IVDR. And finally, if you're a health institution that manufactures in-house devices, there's a separate set of rules again that apply in that context. And if you meet those rules and requirements, then you are compliant with the regulation. So those are the three main routes, but we'll mainly talk about in-house devices. And if anybody wants further information on the other two routes, feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to provide it. So just going to move now to start focusing really on the in-house IVD piece. Before I go into the details, just to highlight some of the resources that are available. So there was a European guidance on Article 5.5 and in-house devices published in January of 2023. Copies of these slides will be made available after this talk. So there'll be links there available so you can access these documents. This European guidance provides an aid to interpret the requirements, and it's a good starting point to understand how to actually read Article 5.5 and what that might mean in practice. And then this in December of last year, I should say not this year, it was last year. December of last year, we published a draft guide for health institutions who manufacture and use in-house IVDs in Ireland. And the purpose of this was to really help support the European guidance, to provide additional information and to help health institutions in Ireland to further understand how to go about meeting these requirements. So we launched this as part of a public consultation, and the consultation remains open until the 26th of January. So the purpose of this consultation is to gain your feedback and really the public's feedback as well on the content of it. Let's say it's most relevant for the people in this call today. But what we're trying to do is to understand if the guidance that we've provided is sufficient to enable you to understand how to go about meeting these requirements. So if you have feedback on any of the topics in the guidance, we would encourage you to submit that as part of the consultation so we can improve the guide before we finally move to publish it in the coming months. On that page, you can see there's a link to the draft guide. There's also a link to a response template. So we put together a quick response template which essentially just captures the line number and the details of your comment and the proposed change. We would encourage you, if you are submitting feedback, to use this template, as it allows us to identify where in the document you feel the changes are needed, and it means that we can update that document quicker going forward, so it reduces our timelines a little bit. And if you have any issues in submitting comments or feedback, please feel free just to contact me directly, and I'll be happy to take your comments. So I'm going to talk now about what is an in-house IVD and then a little bit about how you go about making in-house IVDs and what are the different ways you can make an in-house IVD. So an in-house IVD is defined as an IVD, when we've talked about the definition a little bit, that is manufactured and used only within a health institution that complies with all of the conditions of Article 5.5 of the IVDR, and we'll talk through those conditions in the next section, and is not manufactured on an industrial scale. So let's just go through this a little bit now. So a health institution is defined as an organization, the primary purpose of which is the care or treatment of patients or the promotion of public health. So it means that not every organization can benefit from being able to use this in-house device route. It's only health institutions, and it's only health institutions within the European Union. So primarily hospitals, but there could be other institutions that would qualify as a health institution. So that's the starting point. Only health institutions can actually be allowed to go down the in-house device route. In order to be an in-house device, it has to comply with the conditions of Article 5.5 and it not be manufactured on an industrial scale. Often in-house devices are produced to respond to specific patients' needs. So we don't envisage the industrial scale piece to be much of a blocker, but if there are any specific concerns, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to discuss with you. So the IVDR does provide recognition that in-house devices are pretty critical. They're important, and they provide services for rare diseases and disorders, address clinical needs of certain patient groups, and enable services where there may not be commercially available alternatives. And you'll know this better than me. Often these are created because there are not CE marked devices available, or the CE marked devices are not suitable for the patient cohorts. In the pediatric space, is very rarely devices intended to be used on a pediatric population. Often these need to be modified somewhat. So the whole concept in the regulation was that it acknowledges the critical nature of in-house devices and imposes a minimal set of requirements. So let's remember it's one paragraph in Article 5 and one annex out of 113 articles and 15 annexes. So it is really a small subset of the regulation that applies, albeit it's more than was applicable under the directive. So there is that change that we're looking at. So it does seek to strike a balance between ensuring a high level of patient safety and implementing an appropriate level of registry requirements. So it's more than what was there in the past, but it's not as much as some of the other routes that are available, such as performance studies or CE marking. So how do you actually go about making an in-house device, or what are the ways that your laboratory developed assay may qualify as an in-house device? So in the first instance, you might be making it from raw materials, parts, or components. So you might purchase a primer and then develop it into a genetic test, validate it internally for clinical use. And in that context, you could be creating your own in-house IVD. You could be purchasing research use only products and then using them for a clinical application. So research use only antibodies, you could use them for histopathological staining. You could create an in-house immunoassay out of them. Again, that would be creating an in-house IVD. You could be combining IVDs or products for a medical purpose where they're not, either they're not CE marked or where their combination was not in line with the original intended purpose. So you may be using a few of them in combination where that was not what was intended by the manufacturer. And that might be to try and obtain a level of performance or to try and get some synergistic information. So that might be in-house device manufacturing as well. You could be significantly modifying an existing device. So a significant modification is one made by a health institution that was not intended by the manufacturer. So using a CE marked IVD for a different purpose could be creating an in-house device, for example, something that's intended for screening, using it for diagnosis, or maybe modifying the protocol in a way that's changing the intended purpose of the IVD. And finally, you could be using software, which is not CE marked, to process data derived from IVDs for a specific medical purpose. So we often get asked the question, is it all software? Is a LIMS system considered software, an IVD? And there's a separate guidance document on qualification and classification of software. And if you're in this software space, please contact us and I can put you, basically send you on a copy of that or point you in the direction of it. But what that document, to summarize it, kind of outlines is that it's not all software or basic operations. It's really the more complex side of things. So adjusted calcium is typically not, our software to create adjusted calcium would typically not be an in-house IVD. But if you were doing something more complicated, such as providing a risk score based on the outputs of some IVDs and other information, for example, if you were taking BRCA gene status and using one of the breast cancer models to take familial history and epidemiological models and collate all that information to provide a probability of somebody developing breast cancer over the course of 5, 10, 15, 20 years, then that's more likely to be in the in-house IVD space, and it's less likely to be the simple calculations such as percentages or adjusted calcium, for example. That little bar there is just to remind me to mention that for some laboratory disciplines, like histology, for example, it's very common to make a lot of combinations or permutations of different types of assays. And it may be that you've got a library of permutations of in-house devices out there. So when I talk later on about how you can practically go about implementing this, there's one option there that has taken that into consideration about how best to maybe structure the documentation to try and reduce administrative burden on that. So acknowledging some disciplines may be in that space where there's a lot of combinations or permutations of different types of panels as well. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. So this kind of brings us to a bit of a flow chart to consider when you're looking at whether or not you have an in-house IVD. And we put this together to try and assist in that regard. So the first question you have to look at is whether or not it's an IVD to start with. If it's not an IVD, then you can't have an in-house IVD. So if it's not an IVD, then the regulation doesn't apply. So in order to establish that, you need to look at the definition of an IVD and determine whether or not the product you're using is meeting the definition. And if it's not, there's nothing to worry about in terms of the regulation. If it is an IVD, then the next question you might come to is whether or not that IVD is CE marked. So if it's CE marked, and you don't change the intended purpose. So if it's CE marked and you're using it within the intended purpose, then it's not an in-house device or in-house IVD. You're just purchasing a device and you're using it within the intended purpose. It's compliant with the regulation. Nothing further is required. But if it's CE marked and you are changing the intended purpose, or if it's not CE marked, for example, it's research use only and you're modifying it to be used for clinical purposes, then the next thing you need to look at is, have you met the Article 5.5 requirements and Annex 1 in the IVDR? And if you have, then you have a compliant in-house device. And if you haven't met that yet, then it's not compliant. So you need to look at meeting those requirements. Which brings me on to the requirements for in-house IVD. So this will be a reasonably large section because we're going to take our time and we're going to go through these stepwise so that by the end of it, you should hopefully have a good idea of what these requirements are. This is a screenshot of paragraph 5 of Article 5. So I'll talk, you've probably heard me mention Article 5.5 a number of times already, and I'll mention it a good few times more now before the end. But this is a screenshot of what's written in the regulation. And this is going to be our roadmap as we walk through the different requirements. Before we start stepping through those, I just want to visually show you when these requirements apply. So currently, what we have highlighted here in green is the start of that section, start of that paragraph, point A, and that final paragraph. And that's currently all that applies right now. In May of 2024, these other points, B, C, E, F, G, H, and I will apply. And then that final point applies in D. The points under the blue box are mostly around documentation requirements. And by the end of this, you'll have a good idea of what that looks like. And then that point D talks about a clinical justification where you kind of look to see if there are equivalent devices on the market. And that's pushed to a later point in time. And again, we'll talk through that soon. But just to start off, I'm going to talk about that first paragraph initially, and then we'll walk stepwise through each of these different requirements. By the end of it, then we'll pretty much have finalized all of Article 5.5 and Annex 1. The first paragraph, it's written a bit, well, I personally don't like the way it's structured, but it's because it's a bit difficult to engage with. So it outlines, with the exception of the relevant general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex 1, the requirements of this regulation shall not apply to devices manufactured and used only within health institutions established in the Union, provided that all of the conditions of Article 5.5 are met. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that only health institutions within the European Union can actually take this approach. That's the first point. The next point is that the relevant general safety and performance requirements apply for in-house devices. So it says with the exception of the relevant general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex 1, that means that Annex 1 applies. And then provided that all of the conditions of Article 5.5 met means that Article 5.5 also applies. So in short, this can be summarized by saying only health institutions within the European Union can benefit from this. And if you're manufacturing and using in-house devices, they must meet Annex 1 of the regulation and Article 5.5. And that's kind of setting the scene. So if you meet Annex 1 and the conditions outlined in Article 5.5, then you're compliant with the regulation. So let's just talk a little bit about Annex 1 before we go into the rest of Article 5.5. So Annex 1 is actually quite a large section of the regulation, and it outlines a number of requirements that apply to every IVD. So it applies to IVDs that are CE marked, it applies to IVDs that are being used for performance study, and it applies to IVDs that are in-house, so across the board. And there's three main chapters in Annex 1. The first talks about general requirements, and this is a lot about risk identification, risk mitigation. The second chapter talks about the design, the manufacturing and performance of the IVDs. So how you go about designing the devices to reduce the risk, how you establish the performance of them, so through verification or validation, and how you maybe manufacture them, taking into account certain considerations like whether or not you need biosafety containment or whether or not, if there's radiation involved, how you would protect against that. And then the third chapter talks about information to be supplied with the IVD. And because this applies to all different routes of IVDs, it talks about information to be provided in the packaging, the labeling, and the instructions for use. Now, in an in-house device context, often packaging, labeling, and instructions for use is managed in a very different way. So your SOPs and your protocols probably replace the instructions for use. Your labeling and packaging might be how you label internally, maybe your own batch records. So that system might be a little bit different. So when it comes to looking at those requirements in Chapter 3, it's worth just considering holistically how best to meet those in your current system, rather than maybe splitting them out into the labeling, packaging, and instructions for use. You have to meet all the requirements, but you can look about how you can do that in a flexible way. So in the draft guide that we published, we included at the end of it an example checklist for Annex 1. So this is just a screenshot showing how much content is in Annex 1. So there is a lot of information, and I'd encourage you all to look at this, look at what the content in Annex 1 and become familiar with it. But essentially, the checklist just outlines what the requirement is. It's taken word for word from Annex 1 of the regulation, and it provides a second column to the right of it to allow comments or references to be introduced. So in principle, when you're looking through these requirements for a specific in-house device, you go through each of these requirements and see, well, do I meet those, that particular requirement? And what documentation do I have that supports that? Do I have documentation in my QMS system? Have I got validation data that can support that? And that'll enable you to essentially map where you have the evidence to support all those requirements. And that'll help you down the line when it comes to meeting some of the other conditions of Article 5.5. So that checklist is provided for example. It's not mandatory. You can create your own checklists. All we've done is just replicated the content from Annex 1 and provided it in a tabular form, which we hope is useful. So that's a bit of a run through Annex 1. I won't go through all of the details in it because it's quite long and we'd probably be here for another hour. But I will talk more now about the conditions in Article 5.5. So the first point talks about the devices not being transferred to another legal entity. This is the only point that currently applies and applied in 2022. So there's a couple of things we can consider about this. The first is what's meant by legal entity. Well, a number of hospitals, for example, are part of the HSE. A number of hospitals are independent organizations that may be reimbursed by the HSE. So it's worth considering when you're trying to meet Article 5.5a to first establish what is the bounds of your organization as a legal entity. What other organizations does it engage with, and are they within the same legal entity or not? Because that enables you to put together a policy where you can specify where devices can be transferred to and where they can't. And essentially that could be the output of Article 55A is a policy where you say we're not going to transfer them outside our legal entity. We've identified our legal entity, and then you just follow that procedure. You can transfer samples. So if you need to refer samples to a specialist laboratory that maybe has a specific in-house test or a specific area of expertise, you can send the samples. You just can't send the IVDs that you're making yourself. And that's to keep the IVDs in the organization that's producing them, because they're responsible for the in-house IVDs that they're creating. And also it's where the expertise lies. If you've created it, then you have the most expertise when it comes to actually conducting these tests. So moving on to Article 55B. So this talks about the manufacture and use of IVDs should occur under an appropriate quality management system. So what is an appropriate quality management system? Well, there's no specific standard called out in the regulation for in-house devices. So an appropriate quality management system is one which enables you then to meet the requirements of the regulation, which is Annex 1 and Article 55. We often get the question, I'm accredited to ISO 15189. Is that sufficient as a quality management system? And the answer is it may not be. So you have to evaluate whether the quality management system you have in place is sufficient to enable you to meet the requirements of Annex 1 and Article 55. So you can't just take for granted that it is. But once you've done that evaluation, then you can be certain then that you're operating under an appropriate quality management system. And then on the topic of ISO 15189, point C talks about the laboratory of the health institution being compliant with standard EN ISO 15189, or where applicable national provisions, including national provisions regarding accreditation. So there's a few points we can talk through on this as well. So first off, this mentions the laboratory of the health institution. So it doesn't mention the IVD or device. So that means once the laboratory is compliant with ISO 15189, then that is sufficient to meet this requirement. There isn't a requirement for each individual in-house test to be within scope of that accreditation or compliance. It's just sufficient for the laboratory to be compliant. So that's one point to talk through. The next point is that accreditation to ISO 159 will be the preferred means of demonstrating compliance, but it's not the only means. And the reason why we say it's the preferred means is when you engage the service of an accreditation body, you have an external organization who's coming in and evaluating you against the standard, which means you can be really certain that you are compliant with that standard. We acknowledge that it's not always possible to become accredited to ISO 15189. So there are other means of demonstrating compliance, but in those instances, you would have to take on the responsibility of establishing whether you are compliant yourself and continuously checking that compliance. And we imagine that would be the more difficult of the two routes. It would be far easier to engage the services of an external body. And so it's not to consider other routes of compliance to be the easier option. It's likely going to involve an awful lot more work in order to establish whether you're compliant. And then on the national provisions piece, so there was no specific national provisions introduced regarding accreditation under the IVDR. There are existing national provisions which have been in place for some time. For example, under SI 360 of 2005, hospital blood banks are required to be ISO 15189 accredited. So those previous requirements still apply, but there was nothing additional required on a national level. So then moving on to Article 55D. This point talks about the health institution justifying in its documentation that the target patients group's specific needs either cannot be met or cannot be met at an appropriate level of performance by an equivalent device available on the market. So this could be that there may not be a CE mark device for your patient group or that's suitable for your patient group, or the performance is not appropriate that you can create a device with a better performance yourselves, and that's the justification as to why you are producing the in-house device. But just to note, this doesn't apply until May of 2028. So in terms of prioritization of activities, there's time to look at the justifications and the reasons as to why these in-house devices are being created. And we encourage you to focus maybe on the other aspects that are due to apply in May of 2024. The next point talks about information that's provided upon request of the use of such devices to the competent authority. So that's the HPRA, which shall include a justification for the manufacturing, modification, and use. So there's a few key points here. The first is upon request. So there's two main ways that the HPRA will request information. The first will be a standing request. And there are a couple of topics that we will have a standing request for. For example, we'll request to be notified of organizations that are manufacturing and using in-house devices. And in our next version of the guide, we'll outline exactly how that process will look. The second incident will be, second situation will be if there's a serious adverse event related to an in-house device, we would want to know about that as well. So those are two standing requests that we've outlined in our draft guide, and we'll provide further details on in due course. The other route could be an ad hoc request where we email for additional information, or we email for information on the devices. So, but the key piece here is that this is upon request. The HPRA is the competent authority for medical devices and IVDs in Ireland. And if you need to contact us, you can always contact us at devices@HPRA. And I've kind of mentioned the serious incidents piece. So in our guidance document, we've outlined the process of how you go about reporting serious incidents. So this is if something happens that meets the definition of a serious incident, and there's definitions provided in the guide. We have a process on our website where you can submit a report to inform us of that. We'd encourage you to use that if you're in-house space. You can also submit information about incidents that occur with CE mark devices as well, and through our user report form online. We also encourage user reporting as well, as that helps us identify any safety concerns that could be related to other devices that are out there on the market. So the next point then is talking about public declaration. So this requirement is that the health institution has to draw up a declaration which it makes publicly available. And there's some core information that's outlined. So it should include the name and address of the manufacturing health institution, so who you are and where you're located, the details necessary to identify the in-house devices that you're making, so that it's clear what you're actually producing, and then a declaration that the devices meet the general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex 1. And where applicable, information where the requirements are not fully met with a recent justification. So you can see, in order to make that declaration, then in due faith, you have to go and actually assess whether your device does meet the general safety performance requirements, which is why something like that checklist can be a very useful tool to enable you to do that evaluation. So this declaration has to be made publicly available, and you can consider how best to do that. Often labs have a public website, and that could be a good place to put this declaration. There's also a template that was made available in the European guidance. I'll just show you a screenshot of it now. It's very basic. It basically provides a space for the name of the health institution and the address. There's a bit of text which outlines a declaration. It's the date and the person who's signing that declaration, so who's confirming that the devices do meet the general safety performance requirements. And then there's some details there on how you go about identifying the in-house devices. So that's just an example template that could be used, just reflecting the content of 55F there. Okay. So this next point, Article 55G, applies only to Class D devices. It says here, in accordance with the rules set out in Annex 8. So Annex 8 is the part of the regulation that talks about classifying IVDs, and it provides a set of rules as to how you would classify those IVDs. There's 4 classes of IVDs under the regulation: A, B, C, and D, with D being the highest risk. So what this is saying is, if you're producing Class D in-house IVDs, then you have to draw up additional documentation that makes it possible to understand the manufacturing facility. So what is the infrastructure you have in place to produce these devices, the manufacturing process, the design and performance of the devices, including the intended purpose, that's sufficiently detailed to enable a competent authority to ascertain the general safety and performance requirements of this regulation are met. So this only applies if you have Class D devices, but it's that additional layer of information where you're specifying how exactly you're going to create these devices and what the performance of these devices should be going forward. This point also says that member states can apply the provision to other classes, A, B, or C, but we have not implemented this for A, B, or C. So currently it's only Class D devices that this applies to. I'm going to take a step back and switch and actually talk a little bit about what Class D devices are just so you have a sense of whether or not you could be in the space of making in-house IVDs that could be Class D. So there's two rules under Annex 8 which talk about Class D devices, Rule 1 and Rule 2. So under Rule 1, devices that are intended to be used for the following purposes are Class D. So in the first instance, it could be the detection of the presence of or exposure to a transmissible agent in blood components, cells, tissues, or organs, or any of their derivatives in order to assess their suitability for transfusion, transplantation, or cell administration. So just to be clear, it's not detecting to assess whether they're suitable for transfusion, transplantation, or cell administration. You're looking for transmissible agents in those media to determine whether they're suitable based on the presence or absence of transmissible agents. And I'll give you some examples now in a second. The second point is it could be the detection of the presence of or exposure to a transmissible agent that causes life-threatening disease with a high or suspected high risk of propagation. Or the third point, determining the infectious load of a life-threatening disease where monitoring is critical in the process of patient management. So at the bottom of the screen here, there's a hyperlink to the EU guidance on classification. And that provides further details that explains the kind of thinking behind each of these rules. And it also provides some examples, and I've copied some of those examples here. So commonly under Rule 1, you would see hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, HTLV, hemorrhagic fevers, so Ebola, Marburg Lassa, SARS-CoV-2 as examples that would fall under Rule 1. So if you're making any in-house devices for any of those purposes listed there that involve those organisms, then you're in the Class D space. But if you're not in that Class D space, then point G won't apply. The other rule where you could be creating a Class D device is Rule 2. And this says for devices intended to be used for blood grouping, to determine fetal-maternal blood group incompatibility, for tissue typing to ensure the immunological compatibility of blood components, cells, tissues, or organs that are intended for transfusion or transplantation, cell administration. So if it's any of those purposes, they're Class C, unless it's for any of these specific markers that are listed. So if you're using it for that purpose with the ABO, RESA system, KEL-KIT, or Duffy system, they're Class D. If you're not looking at those systems, then it's not Class D. So if you're creating your own in-house device for those purposes with an ABO, RESA, KEL-KIT, or Duffy system, then you're in the Class D space. Otherwise, it's Class C, and 55G won't apply. So hopefully that gives a bit of a sense as to what could be a Class D device when you start looking at whether G would apply to your organization. The next point, 55H, is linked to G. So under G, you've basically outlined all the documentation about how you manufacture the devices, their performance, and where the devices are being manufactured. And under H, you're endeavoring to, or I suppose, confirming that you're going to take all necessary measures to ensure all devices that are manufactured in accordance with that documentation you've drawn up. So in G, you're specifying what you're going to do. H, you're following it, including trying to reach the performance that you specified. And again, this would only apply in the case of Class D devices. So then moving on to the next point, and we're now back to requirements that apply to every in-house device. So it's just G and H that are specific to Class D. So 55I talks about the health institution reviewing the experience gained from clinical use of the devices and taking all necessary corrective actions. So I suppose the 2 points there, reviewing experience gained from clinical use. So it's important that you put a bit of a structure in how you want to do this. So maybe specify how frequently you want to do the review for the in-house devices, and you're checking to make sure that you're happy with the way they're performing and that they're meeting the patient's needs in the way that you intended. And if any issues occur and there's a need to take corrective actions, that you work towards identifying and resolving those corrective actions in a timely fashion and in an appropriate fashion, and a process in place for that. The final paragraph of Article 5.5 talks a little bit more about the member state and the competent authority. So it's not a requirement, but it just gives a bit of context for some of the rest of the activities. And this just outlines that member states may require that health institutions submit to the competent authority, which is the HPRA, any further relevant information about such devices which have been manufactured and used on their territory. Member states shall retain the right to restrict the manufacture and use of any specific type of such device and shall be permitted access to inspect the activities of the health institutions. And the very last line of the article says, this paragraph shall not apply to devices that are manufactured on an industrial scale. But that's talking about the whole paragraph, Article 5.5, and not just that last little, the preceding point. So it basically says if you're manufacturing them on an industrial scale, you can't really benefit from Article 5.5. So again, we don't envisage this should be much of an issue, but if you feel like there's some in-house device that you're manufacturing on an industrial scale or could be manufacturing an industrial scale, have a chat with us and we can see if there's anything we can do to look into that further. So bringing us back to our roadmap again, just a summary. Currently only that transfer to another legal entity, the first paragraph and the final paragraph apply. In May of this year, a lot of those requirements around documentation will come into force. So the manufacturing and use of device under appropriate quality management systems, compliance with EN ISO 15189, providing information upon request to the competent authority, drawing up that public declaration, points on the Class D devices, so having that additional documentation if you're working with Class D devices that you're making yourself in-house, and reviewing that clinical experience. And then finally, in May 2028, that justification piece will go in. So I'm going to pause and talk a little bit about practical considerations. So in our draft guide, we put a section at the end where we tried to put some thoughts around how to structure this documentation or how to consider this at a practical level that may facilitate a kind of an easier way of implementing it. So this is one of the tables you'll find in our guide, and it lists the different requirements on the left, and then there's two columns, one for organizational, one for IVD specific, and some comments on the right. So if we start going through the organizational column, so here we were trying to call out where some of the requirements you can really address on an organizational level or on a laboratory level, but you don't have to address them for every specific in-house IVD. So for example, once you have a policy in place on transfer of devices and you're following that policy or procedure, then there's nothing additional needed for every in-house device that you're creating. Similarly, if you've evaluated your quality management system as appropriate, then if you introduce 2, 3, or 5 additional in-house devices, that doesn't change that evaluation. You're still able to use that quality management system because you've done that check. The ISO 15189 compliance, because it's the laboratory being compliant, it's not contingent on individual in-house IVDs. The information to the HPRA, I'll split this into two. So the notification to the HPRA will be informing us in due course that you're making and manufacturing and using in-house IVDs. As I said, we'll specify in further communication how best that notification can be made. The public declaration kind of bridges a little bit of both of these categories. So in the first instance, you need to consider how best to make this public declaration, what process you can use to have a public declaration on your website and have a procedure for updating it. But then if you do create a new in-house IVD or remove one from the list, then you may have to make updates to this. So it kind of covers both of these streams. And then moving over to the second column, this is really where you're looking at what needs to be done for each in-house IVD that we're making. So you'll need to do a check to make sure you're meeting the general safety and performance requirements, and the likes of a checklist or a similar tool could be useful in that regard. In 2028, when that justification needs to be made, you'll need to consider on an in-house IVD by IVD basis what that justification looks like. If there's a serious incident, it'll be tied to an in-house device. So you need to report those in-house devices incidents and make sure you keep a record of how serious incidents that may have occurred with in-house devices. Sorry. And we've already talked about the publication, the public declaration. Class D documentation, because it only applies for Class D IVDs, this is really specific only in certain instances. So that's more of an IVD specific requirement. And then the review of clinical experience, again, you'd be reviewing those on a device-by-device basis. So the next step that we took was to try and consider what would that look like from a documentation perspective. So how could you go about structuring maybe folders or the documentation in order to meet those requirements? And we came up with two frameworks, and these are just suggestions. They're not mandatory, and there could be other ideas or suggestions out there which we'd be happy to take on board and consider. But this first framework is really applicable for in-house IVDs where you're making one or two and they don't really have a lot of relationships with one another. So they're not similar technology, they're not similar workflows. So at an organizational level, you can have your records that will cover some of those requirements in Article 5.5. So the transfer of devices, the appropriate quality management system, your means of demonstrating ISO 15189 compliance, the notification to the HPRA that you're manufacturing and using in-house IVDs, and having that process in place for creating and updating public declaration. And then for each of your sort of separate in-house IVDs, you'll do your checklist. You'll have your supporting documentation to support that checklist, your risk assessments, your instructions for use, your SOPs, your protocols. You'll have any data you have from verification or validation activities or evidence from routine clinical use. The additional documentation for the class IVD piece, if it applies. The justification for use of the IVD in 2028. And the record of any serious incidents that involve the IVD and any corrective actions that you've taken. And then any reviews, when you're doing those reviews, it'd be good to keep a copy of that review in the same folder. So you're keeping all your documentation collated so that you know that you've met the requirements and you can support that you've met the requirements in an easy fashion. This next framework was put together with a couple of disciplines in mind. So there's a couple of disciplines where you do a lot of combination or permutations of similar IVDs. You may have maybe one technology you use or one methodology you use. You maybe only swap out a primer or an antibody, but the core methodology remains the same. It's just that the specific target that you're looking at may vary a bit. So in this context, the organizational records are the same as before. So once you have those established, you don't really need to update. Well, if there's any updates to those documentation, then you keep those updated and accurate. But once the organizational records are established, introducing another in-house IVD shouldn't impact those in any huge regard. The next piece we considered is trying to have a framework file or a workflow file where basically you can capture a lot of the common elements. So the checklist for Annex 1, there's a lot of requirements listed in that. And some of those requirements you could cover off with documentation based on the framework or the overall workflow, where there's common elements and you can reduce the risk, or where there's common factors that you can consider. So where that's possible, if you ticked those off on a framework or a methodology, I suppose, file, then the number of gaps that need to be filled when you get to the final actual in-house device are much smaller. So you still have to meet all the requirements. It's just about doing it in a clever way. So if you have a common methodology and you've done that assessment on the overall framework or the overall workflow, then you reduce the amount of work you have to do to look at introducing another genetic test or another immunoassay down the line. So under that framework file, you'd have the checklist with the appropriate sections completed, the supporting documentation to complete or to support that checklist. And again, for Class D IVDs, that specific information on the manufacturing facility and process. And then when you go to the IVD in question, which may only differ from its nearest neighbor by one reagent, or maybe even a concentration or a combination of a couple of different antibodies if you're creating personalized panels, then you're just checking for any of the aspects that haven't been covered by the methodology. And often this will be stuff like performance. So any verification or validation that was done for that particular reagent. Again, if there's anything needed in the Class D space, you need to consider that. You might also need to consider cross-reactivity testing or interference testing if you're doing a lot of combinations, or if you may be merging multiple things that weren't originally intended to. You may need to check that there's no cross-reactivity there, and covering that off and documenting in that IVD file will make sure you meet those requirements. And then the serious incidents will be captured at that kind of final level of detail, so it will be in the assay in question, and then the copy of review again will be at that assay in question. So the purpose of this was just to try and highlight that whilst you need to meet the requirements, there may be different ways of structuring the documentation to try and reduce an administrative burden, especially if you're in the case of where you're making a lot of similar devices or a lot of different combinations or permutations, to try and reduce that work where you have to do a full checklist for every single output. And if you can kind of look for common elements and firm up that evidence to support that, that could be an approach that could be taken. But again, we're open to exploring other options as well. So if you have any suggestions, please feel free to contact us and we can have a chat about them. This is just some suggestions to try and get you thinking about how you might go about meeting those requirements. So then just to kind of start summarizing. So under the IVDR, in-house devices can still be manufactured and used subject to the requirements and conditions of Article 5.5. You do need to meet the general safety and performance requirements in Annex 1, and a checklist could be a useful tool to enable you to check that. In terms of planning for May 2024, we would suggest you work on identifying in-house devices and starting to generate the documentation to explore what method of compliance to ISO 15189 you may feel appropriate is for your laboratory, whether that's accreditation or by other means. And to keep in mind that information will be needed in the form of a public declaration and may be requested by the competent authority. So we've outlined the two situations, the serious adverse events and that notification piece, which we're clarifying for every detail. Which will be, but we may also contact for further information. And just also to remember that that consultation on our draft guide is open till the 26th of January. So please do have a look if you get the chance and come back to us with any comments or feedback. That'll enable us to make the guide into a better version before we finally publish it. And hopefully then it also means it's addressing your needs in terms of the level of understanding and the level of information that's been provided. Keep May 2024 in mind in terms of the next big deadline as you start to focus on activities to prepare for those requirements. Thank you.